Theodora Porphyrogenita, Empress 1042 to 1056. The youngest daughter of Constantine VIII and Helena, Theodora was born in 984 and spent 70 of her 72 years in the shadow of other members of the Macedonian Dynasty. Her uncle, Basil II, who was jealous of his prerogatives, obstructed his nieces from getting married, lest their husbands vie for the throne. By the time of his death in 1025, Basil's two surviving nieces, Zoe and Theodora, were past their childbearing years. Constantine VIII strove to enjoy his own freedom, but after 3 years his own life force was ebbing. He turned to Theodora, asking her to take a husband and rule alongside of that husband, but Theodora refused to consider marriage, so power passed to Zoe instead, who would go on to take 3 husbands, all of whom would serve in turn as emperor. Zoe's first husband, Romanus III Argyrus, exuded weakness and invited challenges from ambitious aristocrats. Since their plot centered around marrying Theodora to gain legitimacy, Zoe persuaded her younger sister to become a nun. Years later, when Zoe's adopted son betrayed her, a crowd demanded that Theodora be elevated to imperial status, which led to the rule of the two sisters together. After several months, and with tensions rising between them, Zoe took her third and final husband, Constantine IX. Theodora maintained her own court at this time and allowed her sister and the emperor's young mistress to do as they pleased. In the end, the other 2 women passed away, and Constantine Monomachos grew ill. Despite the emperor's preferences, Theodora and her supporters established her as sole ruler in 1054. Contrary to all expectations, Theodora proved to be well-informed and talented at governing the empire, winning over all who had doubted her. When a minor illness turned out to be the harbinger of a terminal health crisis, Theodora approved of the adoption of an elderly patrician to succeed her. Thus, the last of the legendary Macedonian dynasty died, doing her duty with a nod, having lost her power of speech. Tall, talkative at least before her illness, and prudish, Theodora Porphyrogenita was the B. Arthur of Byzantium. We don't know for certain what year Theodora was born. 980 is about a consensus figure. I've seen numbers as low as 977 and as high as 984. And those numbers really wouldn't make much of a difference, since in either event, she would have been past her childbearing years by the time that her father was dead, and also she would have still been in her 70s when she herself passed away. So, what we do know is her birth order. We know that she was the third and youngest daughter of Constantine VIII and his wife Helena. We also know that Helena did not long survive Theodora's birth in all likelihood. That would lead to a bit of a problem, by the way, because Constantine would have 3 daughters and no sons. His brother, the elder emperor Basil II, famously never married or had children. And for half a century, Basil was on the throne, and he refused to sire offspring. Because Constantine never had a son, and then also his daughters never married, and also he did not remarry himself after Helena's death, this set up what would be a major succession crisis. It's also worth mentioning that if we do the math, for at least half of Theodora's life, if not a little bit more, the overbearing and overwhelming influence in her life was actually her uncle Basil II. We tend to think of her as operating after that period, and that's the period when she's well known, but for most of her life, she lived in the shadows while Basil dominated the whole state. So we're talking probably about 60 to 65% of her life under Basil. As for her home life, she probably did not get to know her mother Helena very well because she died young, so she would have been fairly close to her father. There's evidence that she and her dad got along pretty well. As far as her other 2 sisters, the eldest sister died young. She seems to have been very religious, and because Theodora was also religious, they might have been on good terms. In terms of Theodora and Zoe, however, they are very temperamentally different. Theodora was of a completely different mold than Zoe, who was obsessed with beauty and preserving her youth until she was in her 60s. So we don't know for certain, but what evidence we do have suggests that Theodora and Zoe were never all that close. Often when it comes to learning the personality of a figure from the Middle Ages, we have to kind of just guess based upon circumstantial evidence. However, in the case of Theodora, it happens that one of the contemporary chroniclers of the era, Michael Pacellus, was someone who knew her and said that she often confided in him, so he knew Theodora quite well. Pacellus tended to be a bit of an oddball and to be very exacting when it came to judging other people, especially when assessing their intellectual abilities. So we have to be a little bit cautious, but at least he does provide a kind of thumbnail portrait of Theodora. Physically, we know that she was tall for a woman and slim, so she was kind of built like her dad, Constantine VIII. But in terms of her attractiveness, she seems to have been unremarkable. No one said whether she was attractive or not, so not really a whole lot to say there. So it's not like with Zoe, where her beauty was really her outstanding feature. In terms of how she acted, she was friendly, and depending on the circumstances, she would either be very talkative or she would be quiet for long periods. She was very pious, worried about observing the rites and rituals of the Orthodox Church, and she often had a lot of enthusiasm for what she was working on. So she was someone who was generally good to work with because she was interested in what she was doing and engaged. And although for the most part she was willing to sort of cater to the stronger personality of Zoe, and then before that she had been largely in the shadow because of her uncle Basil, she could sometimes step forward, put her foot down, and be assertive. But for the most part she was more go with the flow. As she got older, she became more studious and more learned in the ways of government, and she also made an effort to be funny, which Pacellus leads us to think was perhaps not usually successful, but nonetheless she tried. I can't help but think that Theodora was something like the B. Arthur of her day, and I've always thought that. And now that I think about it, there are some things that don't match. Obviously, B. Arthur's characters are a lot more assertive, but I feel like perhaps what Theodora wanted to be was B. Arthur's character Dorothy in The Golden Girls. Like, that was kind of her platonic form of herself. In terms of what was important for the development of Byzantine history and the passing of the throne, Theodora was much unlike her sister. So Zoe was interested in having a sex life and even trying to reproduce a child after she had passed her childbearing years long before. Theodora apparently did not entertain any such delusions, and she also had no interest in marrying at that point in her life. At one point, back when Otto III was looking for a Byzantine princess and was looking at the two, or actually three at the time, daughters of Constantine, she was sort of available, and perhaps she wanted to be chosen and to go west and be an empress. But ultimately Zoe was selected, but then when Zoe traveled to Italy, she found out that her would-be husband had perished, and so she came back. We don't know if Theodora held the same views on marriage as a young woman as she held later in her life, and so I don't think it would necessarily be accurate to say that she was dedicated to virginity. By the time that she made that decision, she was more than halfway through her life, and there was no chance of her having a child, and perhaps she felt like having a husband would be disruptive and would violate her peace. So she may have had different reasons aside from not being interested in marriage and children and all that kind of stuff. When Basil was 5 and Constantine was 3, the throne was usurped first by Nicephorus Phocas and then by John Zimisces. After that, one of their relatives largely ruled on their behalf. By the time Basil really fully came into power, he became extremely jealous of his prerogatives and would brook no sharing of power. After his brother Constantine distinguished himself a bit, Basil then shut down Constantine's career, and more or less told him, you will stay in the palace, you will not be heard or seen, and you will let me run the state while you just sit on the sideline. Basil, of course, had no children. He didn't try to have children either. As for Constantine, he did get married and have kids, but all of his kids were girls, and he was not allowed to remarry, most likely due to Basil forbidding it. Then when it came time for his daughters to get married, Basil once again dragged his feet. For Basil, that paranoia that he had from his childhood never went away, and he made no effort to overcome it. And so, Basil dies in 1025, Constantine now becomes emperor. He's happy to be emperor, but he does have a storm cloud looming over his head. And the storm cloud is that after him, what do you do? Because both Zoe and Theodora, the two surviving daughters, are too old to bear children, and so the dynasty is slowly dying. And there's now no way to save it with the bloodline itself. There also is no cadet branch of the family to turn to. So the only possible solution is to marry off one of his daughters to a trusted person outside the family, have that person rule, and then hopefully from there they figure something out. Maybe that person has a child from a previous marriage, or they can do something like what the Romans did in the apogee period of Roman history, where they have the 5 good emperors, something of that nature. The point is, Constantine didn't want to resolve the biggest and most important issue of his day, and he tried to enjoy himself while he could. So, after he fell ill in 1028, now the time had come. He could not kick the can down the road any further. It was time to make a decision. So he needed to take one of his daughters and then find her a suitable husband. And this is where we finally see both Zoe and Theodora truly emerge as historical figures. Constantine VIII began to look for a successor, and by Constantine VIII I mean mostly the eunuchs who ran his court. And what they were thinking about was trying to find someone who was plausible as an emperor, but also someone who was not particularly strong or overbearing. The name of the game in Byzantine politics was balance of power. The military aristocracy would not tolerate a strong emperor coming in and trying to reduce their prerogatives. They wanted a break from people like Basil, who were overbearing. And so what Constantine's followers were looking for is someone kind of weak and easygoing. And the person they found was Romanus Argyrus, a man who was a little bit older. He was happily married, but also had no children, so there was no possibility of a dynasty. That was important for ambitious aristocrats because if he had a family and would have passed the throne down, then they wouldn't have a chance later to vie for power. So in many ways, choosing Romanus Argyrus is a delaying tactic. It is not a solution. And so Romanus is selected. He is now forced to divorce his wife. She became a nun, so now Romanus is a bachelor, and it's time for him to get married to one of Constantine's daughters. Famously, of course, he'll end up marrying Zoe, but Zoe was not Constantine VIII's first choice. In fact, the first choice was Theodora. However, Theodora, being a stickler for the rules of religion, and also thinking that there was no point in her getting married at this late juncture in her life, declined. She said, "I'm not interested." She said, "He was already married, and also he's a little too closely related to our family. He's a third cousin, so that relationship would technically be incestuous." Constantine then has to turn to Zoe. Zoe has no problems with any of this. And so Constantine decided, rather than finding a son-in-law suitable to Theodora, that he would instead, as time was winding down, just have Zoe be the successor rather than Theodora. What this tells us, though, is that Constantine preferred Theodora. Perhaps it was simply that as someone who was kind of tall and slim and shared some of his character traits, he just liked her better on a personal level. It's also simply possible that he knew that Zoe could be a bit flighty and was maybe not the best choice to be exercising power. We don't really know, and Constantine had to do all of this within a couple weeks' time, so this was a very hurried process, and we don't have a great deal of insight into what he was thinking. But most likely he was deeply annoyed when Theodora started carping about having to get married, and he just, out of frustration, said, "Okay, it's Zoe then." Romanus III, despite being as legitimate as someone could be at the time, given the circumstances, was not the most obvious choice in the eyes of the more ambitious generals in Byzantium. He did not exude competence. He and Zoe began some wild schemes to try to conceive, consulting all kinds of wise men and quacks, some of whom were perhaps not the most orthodox Christians in the world. They also really just didn't run the show very well. Romanus tried to prove his military bona fides, and that worked out extraordinarily poorly. It wasn't quite a disaster, just an embarrassment. And a number of generals started to sniff weakness and wanted to know if they could challenge for power. For anyone who did want to challenge for power, they also knew that a key element of any successful usurpation was having a Macedonian princess on their arm. Zoe was taken, but Theodora was still single. As for her complicity in either of the two plots we're about to talk about, we simply don't know. It's possible that she was engaged in this kind of activity. Perhaps she actually did want to be empress, but she didn't want to marry Romanus for the reasons she outlined. Perhaps it wasn't just her aversion to men. So let's talk about the two men who would use her name, try to claim her hand and the throne with it. First of all, before 1034 but after 1028 when Romanus came to power, we have Pressian. And he's a fairly unlikely contender for the Byzantine throne, as he actually would have been the crown prince of the Bulgarian Empire. Famously, of course, Basil had conquered the Bulgarian Empire. And then the royal family of the Bulgars had been integrated into the Byzantine hierarchy. This had meant that Pressian was a strategist, which is a combination of governor and general under Constantine VIII. When he started the plot, he got pretty far, but then he was arrested and blinded. Interestingly enough, whereas a whole lot of plotters after they're blinded would die pretty quickly because a lot of times they get infected, he apparently had a skilled person conducting his blinding because he lived from at least 1030 to 1060 as a blind monk. So Pressian had a long life after his failed usurpation. The other general who made a bid for power was Constantine Diogenes. He had been general and governor in Bulgaria, where there were still rebels to put down, so he had some real experience. He was a much more dynamic figure than Romanus. His plot, however, didn't go very well either. He was arrested and tonsured, and then he was taken prisoner and kept in the palace. When he was accused again, and it was clear that he was going to be convicted, he broke away from the people who were trying to jail him and instead chose to take his own life by leaping out of the palace windows. So, this is what happened with the men who wanted to usurp Romanus. They failed, but Romanus and Zoe detected a danger, and they figured that there might be a way to prevent anyone else from trying something like this, and that was to limit the number of women who were Macedonian princesses available to marry. So how are they going to take Theodora off the board? Theodora was supposedly implicated in both the usurpation attempts of Pressian and Diogenes. If the story is true and she was guilty, then we also have to give quite a bit of blame to Zoe and Romanus for allowing this to happen not once but twice. If the story that Romanus and Zoe told is in fact accurate, then earlier, back around 1029 or whenever Pressian's revolt was, they already had a spy in Theodora's quarters. They already knew that she was not entirely loyal, and they caught her red-handed plotting with Pressian. Rather than kicking her out of the palace or putting her under tighter guard, however, they wagged a finger at her and said, "No, no, no." And then she said, "I promise I'll be good." "Okay, good enough, Theodora." Then, just a few years later, they caught her red-handed a second time doing the same exact thing with a more formidable foe in Constantine Diogenes. And it was only at this point that Zoe finally decided, you know what, I've had enough. So she went to Theodora and persuaded her that it would be best for the state and for all of them if she would remove herself from the marriage market and become a nun. And so that is what Theodora did. This also raises an interesting question, because we are always told about how pious Theodora was. Was she actually super pious, or did she simply believe in playing the role that she had sworn to play? Did she only act as pious as she did because she was made into a nun, and this was not really what was natural for her? Well, again, we don't know, because we don't really get a good deal of insight into Theodora's inner life. We only know most of what we know about her from the eyes of her advisor, and I guess we could even call him friend, Michael Pacellus. And by the way, Pacellus was also a friend of Constantine IX, who as we'll see, was not on good terms with Theodora. So, for the next 11 years, Theodora will be living in a convent. Meanwhile, Zoe will be married to Romanus III, who will die under very mysterious circumstances in 1034. She will then marry her much younger boyfriend, Michael IV. Michael will die. Zoe will then get largely cast aside by Michael's nephew and successor, Michael V. In terms of what Theodora was doing for this entire 11-year period, what she thought about Romanus' death, what she thought about Michael IV and then his death, we simply don't know. All we do know is what happened when Michael V announced to the Byzantine public that Zoe had been cast aside and would no longer be exercising power in any degree. When Michael V had ridden through the streets with his adoptive mother Zoe, they had been cheered, and Michael V was naive enough to think that those cheers were for him rather than for the princess of the Macedonian Dynasty, this woman who was famed for her youthful appearance and was the living embodiment of this great dynasty that was slowly fading away. And so he decided, I'm going to embrace the people's love, I'm going to kick Zoe out, and I'm going to allow the people to fully embrace my glory. And so that's what Michael did. He deposed Zoe, and then announced to the people that she had been arrested, sent off to be a nun on an island, and expected adulation to flow in. But that is not how things went, because Michael V did not understand politics. He had also removed all of his family supporters, by the way. So when he made this announcement expecting the people to shower him with love, he was stunned and largely defenseless when they showered him with rocks. This also caused many city officials to turn on him fairly violently, including Patriarch Constantine IX, who decided that he was going to go to Theodora's monastery and grab her, that he would put Theodora in power along with Zoe, or perhaps in place of Zoe. Zoe had proven to be a little bit foolish. She had not only married a boy toy, but then had adopted that boy toy's nephew, who had then proven to be a bit of a loose cannon. Theodora was a woman of sounder judgment, according to the patriarch, and he most likely did visit her in her monastery because she was a Byzantine princess, he was a patriarch, so most likely he knew that in her administration he would have some pull. So he got the crowd riled up at the Hagia Sophia, and they were leading Theodora to the palace. In terms of what Theodora thought about this, we actually don't know. We don't know whether this was her idea, whether she just acquiesced in this, or whether she was actually against it. But because the crowd was so fired up, it really didn't matter, actually. When they arrived, this was right when another crowd was dedicated to the task of shouting down Michael V's tearful pleas for mercy. And they were determined to instead put Zoe on the throne. Zoe had been brought back by a different crowd. Zoe was actually pleading for Michael's life. And then all of a sudden, you have this new mob with Theodora at the head and the patriarch, and now we have two mobs with different agendas. One mob wants Zoe, one mob wants Theodora. Meanwhile, you have a sobbing guy who's barely out of his teens and his uncle sitting there wondering if this unexpected clash of the two mobs might be the godsend that will save them from the wrath of being blinded and exiled. It wasn't. In one of the grandest political gestures in Byzantine history, perhaps the grandest gesture of all in terms of the effect it had, Zoe broke the tension. She walked up to Theodora, embraced her, and then invited her to return to the palace. Theodora thought that was good enough. And so the two sisters avoided shedding the blood of the other. They also avoided having the two mobs clash. And while there were some people like the patriarch who were a bit disappointed because he did not want to see Zoe go back to the palace, this was a better solution than keeping Michael in power. When it came to Michael's fate, however, the crowd did not allow either sister to really make a contribution. Zoe once again expressed her opinion that he should not be harmed, but they didn't really care about that, and Michael was duly blinded, and he died not long after that. So now we were in a position where we have both sisters back in the palace, and it's time for them to try to just rule together. They're both mature women. Surely they have the judgment and wisdom required to run the state, if that punk Michael V could do it. The joint reign of Theodora and Zoe at first started off on good terms, and both sisters made an honest effort to make things work. In order to show respect to her elder sister, Theodora allowed her own throne to be recessed slightly behind Zoe's. This also would help offset the height difference between them and make it where Theodora wasn't towering over Zoe. So all of this was very respectful. And Theodora put her nose to the grindstone, as did Zoe at first. Both of them tried very hard to be as conscientious as possible. It became clear after a few months, however, that Theodora was better at this, and that she probably should have been the one to marry Romanus back in 1034. Now, naturally, this annoyed Zoe to be outperformed by her younger sister, who had been on the sidelines for the last 11 years. And so because of that, Zoe started to make noise about how one of them needed to get married and allow a man to rule the state. We'll get to that in a minute. As for the judgment of how the period of sister rule worked in 1042, John Skylitzes, who wrote a little bit later, thought that the two sisters did well, that they made sound decisions. However, Pacellus, who was an exact contemporary and a confidant of Theodora, thought that the joint rule had been a failure and that neither sister had done a good job. Pacellus would actually have a more positive assessment of Theodora's sole rule later. But for now, he thought that neither sister acquitted herself particularly well. And he doesn't really explain the details of this. It also was not a long period. We're talking about maybe 3 to 4 months at most. And it might have simply been that the two of them didn't see eye to eye. So Theodora was more competent, but she had already said that Zoe was more senior, so Zoe's judgment should carry, but at the same time, Theodora's judgment was better. The other problem was that Zoe, although she started off with enthusiasm, did not retain that enthusiasm. And apparently she found governing the empire to be kind of boring. She preferred cosmetics. And so she decided that she was going to use her right under canon law to marry for a third and final time. And that would put an end to having to deal with Theodora and her show-off ways every day. As for Zoe's new husband, this man was named Constantine Monomachos, and he would go on to become Constantine IX. It's very apparent that Zoe chose him because he had flirted with her back in the day before she had married Michael IV. That, by the way, had gotten him into a lot of trouble with Michael. And she very much chose him due to his looks and his charm rather than his brains. No one ever accused Constantine Monomachos of being an intellectual juggernaut. Of course, his reign is one of the most complicated in the entire history of Byzantium, despite the fact that it was only 13 years. It was the 13 longest years, as far as I know, in the history of the empire. That is partly why it has taken me so long to continue the story of Byzantium, because I've been doing my best to try to make sense of everything that happened in the time of Constantine IX. So, look forward to that and know that I will be in pain while putting that together. We're not going to get into the details of what happened now. We're just going to look at things from Theodora's perspective and assume that she's just on the sideline and not fully participating, but clearly, based on what happens later, she was keeping abreast of everything that was happening, even if she didn't have a direct influence. Constantine knew what was up. He was a little too young, and Zoe was a little too old for them to be any kind of love match, despite the fact that they liked to flirt with each other. He also knew that Theodora had to be appeased and could not be sidelined. So effectively what he said is, we will have 3 courts, mine, and then 1 for each of you. You will not be subject to spending allowances. You're too old, mature, and wise for that. So you can spend as you see fit. Just be responsible. They weren't. And they all had a good time on their own. So they were spending more money than they were taking in. Court expenses were out of control, but he had made peace at the court. What's also interesting is that despite the fact that both Theodora and Constantine were generally considered to be nice people, considered to be likable, and generally easy to get along with, especially for people at their level, they really didn't like each other that much. And it's not entirely clear why. So that's something, unfortunately, I'm not in a good position to answer, but just suffice it to say for now that they did not see eye to eye, even though one would have expected them to get along just fine based on the fact that they got along with nearly everybody else. Again, Michael Pacellus was friends with both of them, although he seems to have very much favored Constantine over Theodora. I guess if we want to get super technical, Theodora liked Pacellus. It's not entirely clear that Pacellus felt the same way. He liked the power of knowing Theodora, certainly, though. By this juncture, I think it's safe to say that Zoe and Constantine were largely past caring about appearances and doing things the right and proper way. Whether Theodora felt the same way, we don't know. But after a year or so, Zoe noticed that Constantine was moping around, and it was because he was without his true love, Maria Sclerena. He actually had told Zoe about her. She was the niece of his second wife. And Zoe actually decided, you know what? We're not really a couple in a meaningful sense. This is kind of a legal fiction in many ways. I know I'm too old for you. So what I'm going to allow is for you to bring her to the capital and then eventually to the palace. This, by the way, was more scandalous than it sounded because Constantine was very public with his visits to her, something we'll talk about when we talk about Constantine in more detail. But they actually gave her a new title, Sebaste, which is literally Augusta in Greek, but which is a sort of half step below a full empress. So she is inferior to both Zoe and Theodora, but she's still an empress, if that makes sense. So there are now 4 people in the imperial couple. And that means that despite the fact that really only Constantine and Maria are most likely sexually active with one another, this is still a kind of polycule. So in many ways, Zoe's open-mindedness laid the groundwork for polygamy within the Byzantine court. So this is a pretty interesting arrangement in many ways. Given what we know about Theodora, most likely she was not in favor of this. However, even if she did have objections to it, her objections were either overruled or she simply just let her older sister do what she wanted, which she probably would have done anyway. In fact, Zoe would make friends with Maria. We don't know if Theodora and Maria really interacted much or not. But because Maria was being paraded around by Constantine, and because he clearly was enamored with her and not with these old women, this then led to rumors that Constantine and Maria were going to murder the Macedonian sisters and take full control. So in 1044, a random rumor broke out that Maria had poisoned the 2 sisters, and a mob gathered at the palace ready to storm the gates and kill Maria, but they dispersed when Zoe and Theodora made an appearance on the balcony. So that was one of the more exciting episodes from the Polycule period, but for the most part, even if Theodora most likely did have objections to the weirdness of this arrangement, she was willing to spend money in her own court, cultivate her own friends, and largely do her own thing while Constantine ran the state into the ground, and her sister spent time making new cosmetics, and then Maria actually didn't live very long and died soon after this. So that was what was happening in the court while Constantine was running the state, and not doing a very good job of it, by the way. The Polycule experiment was expensive, but it was successful insofar as it kept the peace at court. But then it would start to fall apart as the aging members of this group started to die. Interestingly enough, the first person to die was Maria Sclerena, who was most likely under 30. So she died around 1045, so that meant that Constantine was now a little bit more depressed because his one true love was gone. It also meant that he had lost his third true love, or at least one of 3 women he could say he truly loved. And then Zoe, who was kind of the peacekeeper and the one who was on good terms with Constantine, died in 1050. That only left Theodora and Constantine, who were not on good terms. So Theodora most likely saw Constantine as a degenerate, perhaps even as an incompetent, because she could see how he was running the state. And he, for his part, probably thought that she was an old prude, and that she was a bit of a threat to him doing what he needed to do, because she might assert herself at any time, and she could potentially even rouse up a mob. However, Theodora was a dutiful person, and she did nothing of the sort. She actually returned to her convent. We don't know whether she was pressured to do so by Constantine, or whether she was simply disgusted by him and decided to go voluntarily. Perhaps she figured that for a woman of her age, that was the most appropriate place to be. We don't know. As for Constantine, he was actually aging a lot worse than Theodora, despite the fact that he was considerably younger. Between age, illness, losing people he loved, and then the stress of ruling an empire and doing so poorly, his health was steadily declining. And so, by the time we reach January of 1055, Constantine IX would be on his deathbed. And at the time, he knew that if he died just as he was, that would then pass power back to Theodora, thus there would be no succession crisis. But he and his advisors didn't like Theodora very much, and so they decided instead to choose one of his buddies, Nicephorus Protuan, and have him come to power and simply ignore Theodora's claim. If need be, Nicephorus Protuan could deal with Theodora on his own. As for Constantine IX, he had a date with death, so he duly died, and now there would be a contest for power between Theodora, who would come back from the convent, and Nicephorus Protuan. We don't know a whole lot about the man who would be emperor, Nicephorus Protuan. He was yet another governor who had worked in Bulgaria, which was a good place to gain experience and gain a reputation. There's also a good chance that he was more a product of the civic bureaucracy, or at least had connections with it, since he was recommended by the eunuchs who came from that organization and surrounded Constantine IX in Constantinople. Most likely because they didn't want to choose someone with a lineage and therefore alarm all of the other ambitious aristocrats with the prospect of never having a chance at power. There's a very good chance that the man that was chosen, Nicephorus Protuan, was on the older side, but still vigorous, and yet also either unmarried or simply without surviving children. That seems to have been the pattern of this era, so I assume it was probably holding true in this case. Theodora luckily had plenty of supporters. Again, remember, a whole lot of people in Constantinople, both commoners and people who were more noble, had a deep love of the Macedonian Dynasty. And for them, it was unthinkable for anyone outside of that family to hold power if there was a possibility of someone in the family still holding power. So long as a Macedonian breathed, they would at least share in the power. So Theodora's supporters jumped into action, and her supporters vastly outnumbered those of Protuan. Protuan was marching on Constantinople. He had arrived all the way at Thessalonica, only to then be overwhelmed, captured, and forced to take monastic vows. And so the would-be Emperor Nicephorus Protuan never really got very far. And as far as his career as a monk goes, we don't know anything about it, so we also don't know if he was blinded or not. Thus, in early 1055, a now septuagenarian Theodora was the sole empress of the Byzantine world. Unlike her sister, she would not be seeking out a man's hand in marriage to do the job for her. As a Macedonian Dynasty member, she was determined to do the job by herself. Perhaps in this sense, she was following her father's example, as he too had come to power at the end of his life and had enjoyed exercising that power. Unlike a number of people in their 70s and beyond, even with the benefit of modern medicine, Theodora was still sharp. She had been studying the art of government in the intervening years, and she was very well informed. There was no aripi-doo, there was no talk of corn pop. It was all business, and Theodora was on point. She also seemed to be generally healthy. There was the idea that she might end up living for quite a while yet. She was vigorous, enthusiastic, and ready to go. Of course, because she was a woman, and her previous stint as a co-ruler had not lasted long, there were a lot of doubts. One thing that Theodora would do early on, though, would show her strength. She refused to pay a donative. Now, typically when there was a new ruler, the armies expected to be paid a bonus to secure their loyalty. But what Theodora said is that she was not a new ruler. Her rule dated back to 1042. It was just a shifting among the emperors. And now, as the Empress Regnant, she was simply the one making the decisions, but she was not new to rule. She actually had multiple years under her belt already. As far as why she did that, it might have been to show strength, to show confidence, or as Caldella suspects, with all the spending that had been happening up to that point, she may simply have been broke. At any rate, though, she got away with it because she was a Macedonian princess and her legitimacy was unquestionable. One person who did oppose her was Nicephorus Bryennius. He was a high-ranking general. She decided to strip him of his rank and property and send him into exile when she learned that he was plotting. So she acted decisively. This would come back to bite her successor in the ass. But at the time, remember, she's still in good health, and so far as she and the people around her know, she might have 10 years left, by which point Bryennius might have died in exile, or lost his relevance among the troops. And then, much to the surprise of Pacellus and others who knew her, Theodora would make almost all good decisions for the next almost 2 years. She would consistently make the right call. And that was something that, in a male-dominated world, no one expected. And she really hadn't had a chance to show what she could do earlier, perhaps. Either that, or this was because of her newly acquired knowledge. We don't really know. Either she could have done this all along, or she had only recently acquired this level of skill. But what she showed when she came to power was the best leadership the Byzantine world had seen since her father had died. Unfortunately, of course, it wouldn't last that long, but still, she impressed everyone. Between the slow speed of communication and also just the brevity of her reign, we can't really say that Theodora had a lasting or major impact on the direction of Byzantine foreign policy. However, this was something where she clearly did have a vision, and where she was turning around many of the things Constantine IX had been doing. Her chief advisor for foreign policy was Leo Perispondylos. He was a priest who had formerly advised a patriarch, so he was a well-informed, well-traveled man. In fact, Theodora typically did turn to churchmen for her major advisors rather than generals or bureaucrats. Pacellus, of course, was also a churchman. And she appears to have chosen someone in Perispondylos who was in favor of a decisive but not overly provocative foreign policy. They knew that while the Arab world was still divided, that they couldn't afford to unite it through undue aggression and provocation. One thing that we know that she did, according to the Egyptian chronicler Al-Makrizi, was to break a promise that Constantine IX had made with the Fatimids. The agreement had been for the Byzantines to actually ship grain to Egypt. And that would be folly, because Constantinople itself required a lot of grain imports, mostly from the Black Sea. But in the ancient world, it had used Egypt as a breadbasket. Egypt was still a breadbasket. And so Egypt had no need of Byzantine grain. It would just be driving up prices in the capital. So Theodora was wise to reject that agreement. She also decided to begin negotiating with the new ruler in Baghdad. So Tughril Beg had conquered Baghdad, and she decided to start dealing with him, hopefully to make an alliance with him and to put pressure on the border powers that lay between Baghdad and the Byzantine frontier. In the east, in Armenia, so this would be in the northeast of Byzantine territory, there were also attacks that were fairly major at the time, but the Byzantine armies on the frontier held their ground and repulsed the enemy. 2 men were involved in that action. One was the governor, who was killed in action, and the other was the domesticus of the East, so kind of the commander-in-chief of the East, a man named Theodorus. So overall, her foreign policy was successful. We don't really know how this would have played out if she had had, say, 5 more years to live and rule, but it seems that she clearly had a different direction from Constantine IX, and she was not willing to appease the still scattered and not terribly well organized Muslim powers of the Middle East. For just over a year and a half, Theodora enjoyed excellent health and governed the empire capably. Then in August 1056, she began to experience some stomach cramps. Now, most of her doctors, early on at least, for the first day or two, thought it was just food poisoning or something of that nature, but then it kept getting worse, and it became clear that it was something life-threatening. Then it became clear that whatever it was serious, and at her age, it would be fatal. So now she too is on her deathbed all of a sudden, and the old problem of the dynasty dating all the way back to 1025, the problem that they've been trying to combat for over 30 years, was here once again. And at long last, in the age of Theodora, there was no one left in the Macedonian Dynasty. This was the end. And so it was up to her loyal advisor Perpetuate and others to find her a suitable replacement. This time, this man could not really wrap himself in the Macedonian mantle by marrying a princess or doing anything of the sort, but he could be adopted by Theodora. And so we get to the rather ridiculous adoption of a man who was probably not that much younger than Theodora, Michael Bringos. Theodora, at this time, was apparently taken aback. She didn't have time to really grieve her own death. Again, she had no inkling that anything was wrong, and she was terrified of death. Perhaps she was also in denial because all this happened so quickly. Then, as her illness progressed, she lost the ability to speak. And at the end, while she was still conscious but unable to speak, Perpetuate got her to nod her assent to legitimate Michael VI. And as far as Michael VI goes, I'm eager to get to his reign because it is mercifully short and simple. It didn't go very well, but it's really simple, unlike the reign of Constantine IX. Theodora was the last living member of the Macedonian Dynasty, which is without a doubt the most successful ruling family in Byzantine history. The person responsible for the dynasty's extermination ultimately was Basil II. And if not Basil II, then the culprit is Constantine VIII. It certainly was not Zoe or Theodora. Now, we tend to get the picture of Theodora that she was opposed to marriage on principle, and that she would have never been willing to get married. But again, as a young woman, we don't know what she might have thought. She never had the opportunity. She wasn't selected by Otto III because they wanted to go for her more attractive sister Zoe. And so far as we know, she was never allowed to be courted because Basil was so jealous of his prerogatives and didn't want a nephew-in-law who had a claim to the throne. So, she, so far as I can tell, did most of what she could do to advance the empire. She was not quite as selfless as Zoe in a way, because although Zoe did have a little bit of selfishness in terms of wanting to have, say, a sex life, Theodora was not willing to bend on her principle of not marrying someone in this way. And so you could argue that even though she was more capable of running the empire than Zoe, she was less flexible, and therefore perhaps less dutiful in the end. However, I think she made up for quite a bit by how well she governed during the 18 months or so that she got to exercise power. She showed that she was a responsible person, and we have to wonder what might have happened if Constantine VIII had chosen someone unrelated to her who she would have agreed to marry. How would a reign of Theodora and her husband have gone? Would they have governed more responsibly? Would they have gone back to Basil's wars of conquest and started chipping away more at those weakened powers out east? If we look at Theodora's own reign, it looks like that would have been the direction that she would have pushed for, that she would have wanted to make use of the veteran armies and commanders who were already in place and transfer a lot of them east to keep chipping away at the decaying powers as the Abbasid Caliphate continued to prove to be ineffectual as an overall framework for the Islamic world. But in the end, of course, her reign was really a failure because there was an issue she had no chance of resolving, the succession. She also had to deal with the unintended consequence of having Nicephorus Bryennius as someone who was very upset with what had happened and willing to take revenge on her successor. So again, so far as she knew, she had several years left in the tank. That's what everybody thought, and then she didn't. So she appointed Bringos at the last minute, or I should say her advisors did, and Bringos would not be up to the challenge of dealing with Bryennius. So I think one of the big what-ifs, there are two that come out of this. One is, what if Theodora had been the one to take husbands rather than Zoe? And the second scenario is, what if she had simply lived 5 years longer? Would that have made a material difference in Byzantine history? I simply don't know. But what I can tell you is that Bringos did not do very well. Next time, we will talk about the man whose rule came between Theodora's exercise of power, the first time and the second time. That man was Constantine IX Monomachos. His reign is nightmarishly complicated, so that one will be a long one. It might even be a two-parter. We'll see. Until then, I'm Thersites the Historian. I hope you enjoyed this exploration of Theodora Porphyrogenita, who is the B. Arthur of the Byzantine Empire.